Welcome back. So in this session we're going to take a look at how we model a character in Maya. We're going to be looking at a very basic character in that it's going to be made up of pretty much nothing but primitives, but we're going to be using some of the tools we've already discovered and using those to augment the character for our purposes. So we're going to be modeling a Lego minifigure character. So if I just very quickly open this up, we can take a quick look at the technical drawing. So this is a technical drawing found online. The actual line work itself for the drawing isn't the greatest. If I zoom in, you can see it's actually quite pixelated. It's not particularly high resolution. It's used more so that it's got the actual dimensions on here for when they're creating something like this for manufacture. But it's certainly high res enough that we can create a very good model from this as reference. So we'll be using this. Now you can just model in 3D. If you've got a bit of experience, you can just jump into the program, create a primitive and just start playing around and kind of work your way through the model and flesh it out as you go. But usually it's faster, you're a lot more efficient if you've got some very decent reference to work from. So just talking about reference here, having a front view and a side view is really helpful in 3D. It's also really good if these are actually in line with each other, so that if I just make a marquee selection here, I can drag this down. So you can see that this technical drawing has the shoulder, the neck, the top of the head and the top of the stud on the head meeting at the same point on both sides. The hands are at the same height on both sides. The feet are at the same height, and the top of the toes here are at the exact same height. So this is a technical drawing that's been designed for this purpose. Sometimes you're going to just have to find reference images that kind of work and use some artistic license, but for today's purpose we've got a very clean reference drawing to work from. So we'll be using that within Maya. So let's get the program started up. Let's find my Maya folder. There it is. So again, I'm on a Mac. I'm on Maya 2017. So if you're using a PC or you're using a slightly different version of Maya, you might find some of the items we're going to use today in a different place, but hopefully you should be able to find them. So again, we've got our new features thing. Just going to click OK. So we spent most of the last video in this view, the perspective view. So we're going to be using our orthographic views today. So to come up to my 4 view mode, I can press this button here. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut with the spacebar. So if I've got my cursor within the screen and I hit the spacebar, it's going to jump me into my 4 panel view. It's a very quick hit with the spacebar. It's not a press and hold, because a press and hold will bring up this menu system. So it's, if I want to jump between any of these screens, let's say I want to jump into the front view, I can hover over and I can press the spacebar quickly and it will jump me into the front. If I'm in the view again, I can then press spacebar. It's going to jump me back out to the 4 panel view instead. So I've got my perspective view, I've got my top view, front and side. So we're going to use these front and side orthographic views in order to position and model our character. And we're also going to bring our reference images in and line them up with the grid system on here, so that we know that we're pretty much in line with the kind of the sizes, the tolerances, the heights of each of the primitives we bring in, and that should hopefully keep us on track. So the way we go about doing that, if we go into this panel and we go into view, down the bottom here I've got image plane, and so this is going to bring in a image as a 3D object so we can use it as a plane. So I'll go import image, and then on my desktop I've got that Lego minifigure image. So I'll click open, and there we go, it's now in our 3D scene. So you can actually see it here in our perspective view. But we can also see it from the front on view. We can't see it in the side view because it's perfectly side on with the cameras looking from this way, so we're just seeing the kind of razor edge of the plane. And the same thing applies for the top because the top's looking down. So what we'll then do with this is we will jump into the front view, press space, and I'm going to zoom in, so I'm just using the scroll wheel. And then from this, then what I need to do is I need to position this reference image so that the center line falls on the center line of our origin point. So if you remember, we looked at the grid. We've got the kind of slightly darker grid lines are the ones that form our origin point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press W on the keyboard to bring up my movement controls, and you see we now have our Y-axis and X-axis, and I'm going to move us along in the X-axis to line this up with the center. We're going to want to try and get this fairly close to center, something like that. If I have a look in my channel box for this object, we can see how much have we actually offset this by. Oh, it's not going to show me, is it? Never mind about that then. I was just going to see if I can find an actual reference number to give you that would be easy for you to input, so you know you've got it exact, but we just get to eyeball it, so that's fine. Right, so I'm going to press spacebar to jump back out again, and then I'm going to come to this view, our side view, and do the same thing. So view, image plane, import image, select our Lego minifigure, and then I'm going to jump into the side view, pressing the spacebar. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to hover over our Z axis on this one, and I'm going to line this up there. So now if we have a look in our perspective view, we've kind of got this cross section going, and this is kind of what we're trying to create. We're trying to create something that from the front looks like this, but from the side looks like this. So that's something that obviously we're going to be working towards as a major goal. But it's going to get annoying if these two image planes are just in our way the whole time. If we're trying to, let's say that we build a primitive, this primitive, we can see a bit of it here, a bit of it here, a bit of it here, a bit of it here. That's just going to get in our way. It's not going to be something that we're going to want to have throughout the whole of our modeling process. So there's a couple of things that we can do to help us with that. The first thing is it's probably going to be useful if we get rid of some of the opacity of this, because it's very white. It's going to really be hard to kind of see the contrast of our lines here if it's this bright. But also it'd be nice to see some grid behind it, so that we can kind of get a bit of an idea of perspective, because it kind of falls off into nothing here and we can't see anything here. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to select each one, and then within our channel box here, we've got our alpha gain. So if you've done any work to do with video manipulation or image manipulation, alpha is the transparency of something. So if something has an alpha of 1, it would normally mean in most programs that it's fully opaque. So if I drop this down to, let's say, 0.4, we're now down to 40% opacity. So I can actually see the grid slightly as it kind of goes through, and it has the secondary thing that it actually doesn't seem as bright within the UI anymore, which is quite nice. It's going to hopefully make being able to see lines a lot easier. So you can see that if we were to keep modeling like this, we can actually see through, and it's much easier to see where the lines join up. So we'll do the same with this one. So I'm going to knock this one down to 0.4. So again, alpha gain 0.4. But we're actually going to do something else as well, because I actually just want them completely out of my way. So let's talk about the orthographic view. So the orthographic views, which we have for the top, the front, and the side, they do something pretty special, which is that they will show you an absolutely flat version of this elevation of the model, and if something gets further into the distance, it will not scale it in any way that you would expect a 3D object to scale. So what I mean by that is that if something moves further away, the way that we perceive things in 3D is that they get much smaller. Now that happens in the perspective view. You know, if I were to move this cube that we've created, if I were to move this, you know, really far into the background, so we come from this view, I can demonstrate this. So as we kind of push this further and further away, do you see how it's got much smaller now? So that's kind of how we expect things to move, obviously in the real world. But in an orthographic view, that doesn't happen. So let's say that we take this this one here, which is our side view. I'm just going to move our perspective round to the orientation that it should be, so like that. So we've got our side view here. Now, if we take this side view and we decide we want to push that completely out the way, so we can zoom out from the top and we can literally push this as if it were miles away from our center. And we can do the exact same thing here with the front view. Now, in our perspective view, where we're going to be able to orbit around what we're doing, select things, and actually make changes, you know, these files are very unlikely to be clicked now, because we've got, you know, the image file is over there, and then the other one actually I've pushed really far in the back there. So the chances are we are not going to misclick either of these. But most importantly, if we look at our orthographic view, they are completely unchanged. And that's because of the way that an orthographic view gets treated as opposed to a perspective view. So there we go, that's that process sorted for us. So what we'll tend to do is we'll start to flesh this out using primitive shapes or primitive forms. And you could do it all in one pass, or you could do it in a multi-pass setup. So to do it in one pass, you would kind of go through and say, well, I need a cylinder, so let's create a cylinder. Let's go to our scaling, and let's get this scaling roughly for the head like that. We'll go to our movement, move it up here. Also, actually, while I'm at it, I'm going to go into my shading options within this panel, and I will turn on X-ray, which will mean that I can actually see the image underneath. So anyway, so I've got my head roughly in place. I could then say, well, I'm going to need a kind of cubish shape for the body, so I could kind of you know, move this into place, get this roughly where it needs to be at the right sort of size. I could then also say, well, actually, I know that I'm going to need to change the width of these, so I could kind of get the vertex here, and then go into my scaling again, and I could scale them this way, which kind of roughs out what we need there. And then we could say, well, we probably are going to need a section for each leg, so we could kind of make another one of these, and then move it down to roughly the center there, open up our scaling, make them as tall as they need to be, and then kind of half that there, move one there roughly, and then Command D and move one there. So that's made a copy of those, and of course we then need another few of these, so these are more cylinders. And we'd be kind of shuffling these like this and like that, and then moving these roughly over here and rotating them in place. So we could do that, and then we can Command D, and with that one I will go to scaling, and I will do minus in that direction. Oh. In fact, we'll just move it over. It's better to show as many options as possible, so we'll move it over and we'll manually rotate that using those tools. So we could start like this, and this is going to start roughing out the idea here. Now, we've only been working in the front view, so we haven't had the ability to scale anything in the Z axis. So what that means is that whilst generally speaking, if we're going to look at this from the front like this, we might have our proportions, you know, roughly okay. From the side, we aren't anywhere close. So you would generally then work in passes, and you then go onto the side. We can turn on X-ray on this side as well, so we can kind of get an idea for this. And with our shapes then we can just rough these out to about the approximate sizes we need. So we can get these down to, let's say, that for the arms. Obviously there's a bend in them, but it's not something we would do at this stage. We can do that for the other arm. We can squish the body in a bit and squish the legs in a bit. And so, you know, if we're now looking at this, I need to do the other leg, sorry. Select the other leg, there we go. So if we were then looking at this, you know, we're starting to flesh out the idea of these shapes, or these forms rather. So we could do that. However, this is kind of starting a process where we're doing everything all at once. And I really wouldn't recommend working like that until you're very, very confident in building things. It can start to get a bit confusing. It can be very hard to kind of click the right object. You know, if you're trying to click something that's in here, well, it's a real pain when you've got kind of really close together geometry to try and connect. Especially if we were to start doing the kind of midsection and the leg connectors that are on a minifigure. So I'd actually recommend that we start piece by piece, and we basically just start with the head. So we'll remove all of that, but it's good practice just kind of placing things and getting this as an idea. And we're just going to start working on the head today. So we'll go into our front view and we'll take a look at the head. Now the cylinder that we created has got some inputs to it, so let's take a look at what it's done. So it's given us a radius of 1, although we've changed the scaling in order to get it to fit. So actually let's try and do this in a bit more of an efficient way. Let's set our scaling to 1 on everything. And then let's change this on our inputs. So we can take our radius and put sort of 0.38, which was about the width it needed to be, maybe 0.39. And actually maybe 0.4. Just try and find what does it actually need to be to kind of fit the width here. And that looks about correct to me. So the height then, well, the height we can try 1. That's still too high, so 0.8. It's a little bit too high, so 0.75 might be the ticket. Obviously we can start to tinker with this in a second, but it kind of helps to get a decent base point before moving on. So probably 0.7 is about right, and we'll just have to move it, which makes sense. So why have I done that? Well, generally speaking, it's good practice to have your inputs be roughly what you need them to be for the form that you're trying to create, rather than changing the scaling of an object from the get-go. Now, that isn't always going to be a major problem, but the reason why it's useful to have the scaling set to 1 before you've made the major changes is that, let's say that we created all these pieces as modular parts. So we create the hands as a modular part, the arm as a modular part, the kind of belt piece as a modular part, each leg, the chest and the head. If they're all individual modular parts and they kind of start with base geometry that has a scaling of 1, it means that we can kind of make them interchangeable. It means that when we bring them all in together, their understanding of their relationship to each other and their general scaling should generally all come from the same point. So if we then are trying to make larger versions, or we're trying to translate their position, you know, somewhere else, it's all calculating based off of this scaling of 1. Now that scaling is going to change. There's nothing we can really do about the fact that the object is going to change as it gets kind of scaled around. But if we're kind of starting from it as a base point, it's just a good, clean way of working that hopefully should mean that things kind of marry up mathematically. So that's why I did that. So let's now have a play around with this then. So we're going to, first of all, we're going to move this just ever so slightly down. And there we go, that feels about right. Obviously we're working within a certain level of tolerance that we've got lines that we're working to. And you know, it's a question of, well, are we on this part of the line or that part of the line? The other thing I've also just noticed is that, so our x-axis is at absolute 0, but you can see we are slightly offset here in that on our image, we are on the very right hand side of the center line, and we're actually missing the edge here, and we're slightly further over on the edge here. So because of that, I'm actually going to move the image just slightly, because it's going to help everything if we're more lined up than that. So let's take a look now. We could do with the tiniest touch more. There we go. Okay, that looks okay to me now. So let's start playing around with this then. So in our inputs, we've got a subdivision axis of 20, which is quite a lot. It's probably a lot more than we're ever going to need. That being said, it's a character's face, and faces tend, even if it's something like this where there's not going to be any deformation that happens, you know, if you take the Lego Movie for example, when any character is talking, their faces, facial animation is created by a decal that changes, so it's almost like it's printed on their face. It's not actual changes to the mesh. But either way, we are going to be seeing that face up close if we were going to be using this as a character. If we're going to be smoothing this, which we will be doing, 20 subdivisions is still quite high in my opinion. So we're probably going to want to reduce this, but you know, you would argue you could get away with 8 subdivisions. Sometimes you can get away with 6 subdivisions. But 12 will probably be a good point for us here, because it's not going to be creating all this extra geometry for no reason, but it's also going to be, you know, fairly high fidelity anyway. So I'll make that into 12. It's also quite nice because the way it works out is that we've got almost like a kind of guide to where the face decal should be, based on, you know, 12 fitting this as a quite a nice little section where the actual face gets printed. So that's quite good. Right then, so the next thing then is looking at the subdivisions on the height. So we could automatically put in subdivisions going this way, so across kind of left to right. But we know that we're going to need to put ones in here in order to stop it from smoothing into a completely rounded shape. If you remember from our first video, I can smooth a mesh by pressing 3 on the keyboard. So 1 is unsmoothed, which is what we're in at the moment. If I press 3, we're going to get the smoothed version. And so the smooth version kind of looks a bit like a pumpkin, in that it's got these little ridges that get formed based on where we've got these subdivisions. But we're going to need to place our own edge loops in order to describe this curve as we actually want it to be. So we aren't going to be putting in any extra subdivisions around the height, but we might want to put some in for the top. So if we look at the top here, this is the cap. If you imagine, we've got to kind of grow the head stud out of here. Yeah, so this is the head stud that comes out. So if we imagine that at the top, once the kind of bevels happen from the edges here, we're actually going to need an edge loop that kind of describes where the corner is for where this will be. We're then going to need to grow a section up. And then we're also going to need enough that it keeps a section in the middle. So we can probably put 3 subdivisions on the cap and be able to use that to create this head section, and then we'll create some more edge loops around it to give us nice defined edges. So let's do 3 subdivisions there. So that's just going to give us kind of 3 rings to play with, and as you can probably start to actually just imagine, we'll be able to select this middle one here, grow it up, and then work with that as an extra piece of geometry. and we'll equally be able to do it on the bottom for where the neck is, although we'll probably change where this edge loop actually fits in. So let's start playing around with this then. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start from the front view. I'm going to begin putting in some edge loops. So the way I'm going to go to that, in my mesh tools, I've got insert edge loop, and we can click on that as a tool. It does have a toolbox here where we can change how it's working, but it's all good, literally ready to go out of the box. So I'm going to select the insert edge loop tool, and the way that this works, then I need to hover over the edge loop that I want to intersect. So it's kind of interesting because you need to remember that you wouldn't want to start here and drag it down, and that's going to give you another version of left to right. You actually need to be on an up and down one, and then if you click and drag, it's showing you an intersection of edge loops. So what we'll do then is we'll put one at the start of where we have a bevel, and we'll put one at the end of where we have that bevel there, and we'll take a look at it as an object. So we'll go back to our selection mode. I'm going to right click and go to object mode. There we go. And so then if we come out and we press 3, we're going to smooth that over. So we can start to have a look at what that's doing, and obviously we can then see this in our front view, and we can see that, you know, it's sort of doing what we want it to do, but it's smoothing over too slowly. So it's kind of it's not too slowly, it's too fast. It's curving quickly up here. We actually want it to be a slower curve and then come down to a straighter part here. So there's ways that we can fix that. And what we could actually do is, if we go back to, if we go on to 2, so I've pressed 2 on the keyboard, so that's going to show me my original edge loops that I can select, but it's also going to show me the resulting smoothed mesh, so that's kind of helpful. So on here then, where we have our edge loops, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go into edge mode, and so this is going to allow me to select our original edges here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click those, and by double clicking them it selects the whole edge loop there, and I'm then going to double click, I'm going to hold down shift and double click here, and now what I have selected is the 2 edge loops that go around the center there, and I want to be able to modify these so that they work in tandem. I don't want to move one without moving the other, because as we know, the space, the section of the form that the face is printed on is perfectly flat, and if I were to move this one without moving this one, we'd have a slope going from it being wider here to the bottom here. And even though I could change this one first and then kind of go in and change this one, it's very hard to get them to be absolutely perfect unless we move them together. So I'm going to play around with this now. So we're going to go into scaling, because that's the first thing we're going to want to do with this. So we look at our scaling options. Now, if we were to scale this uniformly, so let's see what that does. If we scale this uniformly, so we can either bring it in or we can bring it out. So bringing it out is kind of helping in some ways, but it's not helping exactly what we want it to do. You can see that what's happening as we kind of scale this out is kind of bowing around those edges, and it's also pulling the top in a way that we don't want it to. And that's because the scaling is also just kind of pulling it up and down from itself, because we've got this y-axis scale as well. So I'm going to undo that, Command Z. And if we were to be in this front view here, it's going to do the exact same thing, because it's going to be scaling everything together. So actually what we kind of need is a bit of scaling from the front, but viewing it from the scaling from the top, but viewing it from the front. So you see that if I scale from here, we have a bit more control as to, you know, we're not moving the top section as much. and we can kind of get a bit of a better bead on how this is created. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale this out until our edge loops meet the very edge of our line drawing, which it does there. And then I'm going to add a couple of more edge loops now into our model. So I'm going to press 1 again to go back to our original model. I'm going to go back into Mesh Tools and I'm going to go into Insert Edge Loop. Now I'm going to put a edge loop very close to where our previous ones were. And what this is going to do is it's effectively going to make the section in between these next two, it's going to make it kind of impervious to smoothing. Because what smoothing's doing is it's kind of looking at 3 points. It's looking at, you know, this point here and this point here, and then previously this point here, and it was making a curve in between them. Whereas what smoothing will do now is it's going to look at this point and now this point and make a curve. And because this point and this point are the same, effectively nothing can happen in terms of smoothing. So it will be leaving these out. So if we now hit 3 to smooth, what we should find if we go into our front view is that we're nice and straight across here, and we're starting to create a bit of detail in the top section here. So what we now want is to play around with the edge loops that we've got in place to try and get these to fit as best as possible. So what I will do, I will double click on this edge loop and the one underneath it. We will go back into our scaling and I will scale these from the top. I'm just going to zoom in here so we can see what we're doing slightly better. So scale those in slightly from the top, and then we're going to take a look at it now that we have made those changes. So we'll go to object mode. Oh, I accidentally pressed the wrong one. Object mode, and then we'll press 3 again to have a nice little look at what we've created. So we're starting to get somewhere now. You know, we're starting to describe this shape as we kind of want. So what we need to do is we need to then bring these sections in, you see, that are starting to bow out here, and we're going to need to select those. So we'll go to Edge, double click that one, and we will hold down Shift and double click this one. And so I'm going to try and pull these in so that they all kind of meet at the right point. And so the way we'll do that is the same that we have been using. So we'll be visually looking at it on the front, but we'll be operating it from the top. So we'll go into Scale, and then we'll start to pull these in. And you see now this is really changing how this bevel works. The reason I wanted to put the extra edge loops in before we started this is because this push and pull, you can kind of see that actually I can show how it's impervious to this smoothing. If I pull it here, it's curving against that top line now, which again, that was what I was trying to achieve, so that we would hopefully have a bit of control here. The issue with trying to do this part first is that you then put the extra edge loops in and then hit smooth, and it's kind of a trial and error thing. You actually have to then kind of go back and make tweaks and go back and make tweaks. And it's not a wrong way to do it, it's just it tends to be a slower way to do it, and you don't really end up with the result you want as fast as you could if you just did it this way. So that now gives us a very clean kind of following around this line drawing, and I'm very happy with how that's worked out. And obviously we're in smoothing mode, so that means that, you know, this is how the mesh is actually going to be used within the actual final use of it. So this isn't you know, if we look back at our first mode, this isn't, you know, this mode where if we get it roughly right, we don't know it's going to be perfect until we hit smoothing. We know that in theory, this is actually what we're after. we're getting this ever so slight kind of edge here that we might want to try and play around with. However, if we actually look at reference of Lego minifigures, this is something you do actually see on them. So if I quickly Google Lego minifigure, I will also point out that it's really quite important to do reference as best as you can, so that you are looking at things whilst you're working. But you can actually see that the very edge here is, you know, causing a bit of a shadow that happens on that lip. So it's not exactly something that we might want to get rid of. And also we haven't yet lit this. So I think we're in a good place anyway, and we can certainly crack on with where we're at. So the next thing then is to try and make this this stud come out of the head. This part there is a bit of trial and error, and the trial and error is that that we don't have a top-down view of the of this technical drawing, which would be really helpful if we did, because the top-down view would tell us exactly what width this section needs to be in this point and in this point before we drag it up. Unfortunately, because we don't have that, we kind of have to do a bit of a test, and then if it doesn't work, undo it and then make a slight change and then redo it. So let's look at the process anyway. For this one, I'm going to go into the perspective view, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to face. So our face is the faces of these sections. So we had our edges, which were the blue lines. Our vertices are the sections that are kind of meet in the corners, and then these are our faces. And so what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be selecting, so I'm going to click, and I'm going to hold down shift to click another, and I'm going to click around here. And we're going to be using the extrude tool, which is in our modeling toolkit. And what the extrude tool does is it allows us to grow geometry up from a section. Obviously we've got quite a bit of smoothing on at the moment, but we'll be able to fix that in a minute. But I want to now come into the front view and just take a bit of a look here, because the aim is to get it to roughly fit the height that we're after here. So we can see that at the moment we're a little bit wide, so we're slightly wider than what we would necessarily want to be. What I want to do before we undo any of this work is I want to see if that changes once we put in the extra edge loops that we know that we're going to need. So to stop this edge being so smooth, what we can do is we can add an edge loop. If I go back to unsmoothed, I can add an edge loop in here and an edge loop in here, and that's now going to stop this section being smoothed, and it's going to be a fairly solid section that moves up. It will have some smoothing because we have to put these right up to them in order to completely remove the smoothing, but it's something that we can have a look at. I'm also just going to put a few in here so we can get a bit of a better idea as to actually where are we. But I imagine we are probably going to have to make some changes to the model before moving on. But let's have a look at where we're at. So in terms of its actual just general look, I mean, it looks fine, and the process that we've created this kind of slightly smoothed but like generally straight edge works absolutely fine. But as you can see, it is definitely too large. So it's too large by quite a bit, so we'll have to make some changes to the geometry. So we'll go back into this mode, and we will, if we go into our edges, we'll be able to see those slightly easier, and we will just undo until the extra edge loops are gone, and we will then undo till the extrude is gone. So the extrude is now gone. If I go back into perspective, now I'm going to be able to start looking at this properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my edge loop, my edge tool, and I'm going to select this edge loop, and I'm going to scale it uniformly. So I could do this from the top view, but I'm probably going to have a slightly better bead on it if I do it manually. I'm just going to kind of move that to about there. What I'm also then going to do is I'm going to come into the front view, and I can just about see the edge of it here, and I can see that it extends past what we need. So I'm going to come back here, and I'm kind of watching what I'm doing on the perspective view, but also at the same time I'm trying to watch the front view. And okay, that looks about right. And then I'm going to select the interior one here. And this one is really difficult to see anyway. Can we see it at all on this one? And the answer is no. The reason the answer is no is because it's perfectly in line with the edge loop that's in front of it, which is the one that we've just moved. So what I can do is I can move it up just out of line with the other one for 2 seconds, which will allow me to kind of have a look at whether or not we need to change it. And there is the slightest amount of overlap there, so we'll uniformly scale it a tiny bit there and see if that's fixed the problem. Which if I now go in, it seems to. So it was basically getting this intersecting line to line up there, and so that looks fine. And what I'll now do is I will move it back into place, and we ideally want this perfect. So I'm going to zoom right in, go into the side view. I'm going to zoom right in, and in theory I should never be able to see any of the orange on this line, because that's indicating that I can see what I've got selected. So when I can't see any of it at all, it means it's in theory perfectly behind the other vertices. So we could do that in this way, and there's certainly no reason why you can't do this, but there's actually a quicker way. So let's say that we're back to where we were and we've got this ever so slightly raised section here. Well, actually, if I take this edge loop that we've got and I now hold shift and select the other edge loop, if I go into scaling and I scale them down in the y-axis, what will happen is that they collapse together like so. So now that I know that I've got them absolutely together, there's no way that they could have deviated in any meaningful way. I can now just come back into here and just make sure that we're happy with the placement of this and that we've got it at the top of the head, which I think we have. So what we will do is we will now re-extrude this section. So we will click back into faces. We've got our faces selected here, and then we will extrude. And we will extrude up to the height that we need there. And so we already know that if we put in our edge loops where we need them to be, they're roughly going to work. So let's get that done. So we'll go into Mesh Tools, create edge loops. We'll jump straight into this view. And again, so I had one butting up here to arrest any smoothing that would happen on this face. I had one at this edge here, one at this edge here, one here, one on the inside here, one coming down here, and then a final one which actually this is a really good interesting point to kind of bring up. So the issue we currently have is that the last one is in the after the first section that we have here. So actually what we'll need to do in order to create an extra edge loop here is we'll need to add it in the central part of here, and then we'll need to select the edge loop that goes around that first one, and then we'll uniformly scale that one in as if we had created the other one, and we'll move this one down into place. And in fact, we will select them both together because that'll be the cleaner way of doing it, and we will scale them down together. So again, using that same trick that we did last time to keep these lines perfectly parallel to each other, effectively we've created an edge loop before the origin point edge loop. So basically it's now the earliest edge loop in the system. So if we now go into our object mode and we hit 3, we should now have the top stud of our Lego character, and hopefully we should be following the lines that we wanted to. And you could argue that maybe we could do with slightly moving these edge loops so that they give us a bit more of a bevel here, but generally we're in the right place. This one certainly seems fine, and I might just again go into my edges, select those there, and all you need to do for these, we can just move them down, and you see they start to give us a bit more control of those edges. Go into the top ones, and then this one here we can then go into our scaling, and we can uniformly scale that, and that's going to scale it inwards, and that's going to kind of just give us a little bit more of a curve there around the edge. Okay, and I think that's a very good place for us to kind of leave the head. There is more work required for the head if we go back into object mode, in that we need to do the same on the bottom, and that will be a case of figuring out how wide this section needs to be, and then extruding that down to the length it needs to be, and then giving it the same sort of treatment for this section, the top and the interior section of it. But I won't be doing that in this video. That's something that if you would like to kind of continue this on and challenge yourself to do something, then that's obviously something you can do on your own. The process involved will be very much the same, but it will be your own measurements and a little bit of an experiment around the program. And that's all we'll cover for this. If you want to look into how to model the full figure, we can either do that as a one-to-one session, or you can look at this YouTube channel here. If you put into YouTube modeling a Lego minifigure in Maya, you'll come up with this person's video, and they do a very good process that goes through the absolute whole of it. It's truncated in a way that allows you to kind of see a section and then obviously copy it, as opposed to being a full live demonstration. But that is a very good resource to look at if you would like to carry this on into completion. But I do recommend that you try doing at least the bottom part of this neck on your own without any assistance in any way. Right, thank you very much. I will see you in the next video.